And that's what it is. Former Senator Paul Tsonga said we have a debt addiction. And like a drug addiction or an alcohol addiction, getting rid of the addiction is painful. When they say on the floor that it's going to be painful if we adopt this amendment, I have never suggested anything to the contrary. But it's going to be infinitely more painful if we don't get rid of the debt addiction. That we have to face, and the American people have to face. Senator Cohen on this floor this afternoon said what we're doing is fiscal child abuse. That's precisely it. I have one granddaughter, and I'm going to become a grandparent twice more this year, if I may brag, Madam President. What we're doing is borrowing money from those children. And if I have a choice, and if the American people have a choice of a little pain now and not borrowing from those children, I think the American people want to make the same decision I have made. Let's have a little pain now, and let's do what's right for the future of those children. We can create a more prosperous country. The Wharton School says if we adopt this, 30-year bonds are going to go from 6.5% to 2.5%. What that would do to industrial investment, home construction, and everything else. New York Federal Reserve Board says we lost 3.25 million jobs because of the deficit from 1978 to 1988. How many more millions we're going to lose before we get a hold of this, I don't know. We face a choice, finally, Madam President, of agreeing with those who say let's continue to drift, or agreeing with Thomas Jefferson that we ought to limit our borrowing. And I want to agree with Thomas Jefferson. I want an amendment to the Constitution.
The senator's time has expired. Who yields time?
Madam President, how much time remains?
Under the previous order, the senator from West Virginia now controls 30 minutes.
And the other side controls. The two leaders have 20 minutes each.
The senator is correct.
Madam President, I yield 3 minutes to my friend from Maryland, Senator Sarbanes.
Madam President, I thank the distinguished chairman of the Appropriations Committee for yielding me time. Madam President, I have spoken before on this amendment, and I don't intend to recount all of that, but I do want to address some points that were made here. My dear friend from Illinois is fond of quoting Thomas Jefferson. Now, it's true that Jefferson indicated early on that he would have put a provision in the Constitution for a balanced budget. But when he became president, he never sought that. And in fact, Jefferson made the Louisiana Purchase one of the great steps in developing our nation, made the Louisiana Purchase on the basis of borrowing. There was no other way to do it. In the War of 1812, when Jefferson was then out of office, he wrote to his friend Madison and suggested that the federal government borrow in order to finance the war. So much for this constant reference to Thomas Jefferson. Now, I listened very carefully to the senator from Illinois, and he talked about the provision in his resolution which allows a 60-vote majority to waive its requirements. And he suggested that in a time of pressing necessity, the 60 votes could be obtained. But I simply want to make this point to my distinguished colleague. The deficit reduction program that the Congress passed last August, the very tough medicine that we've been talking about taking, the program that had spending cuts, substantial spending cuts, and revenue increases in it, the very program that has brought down the deficit trend line, as a distinguished senator from New York pointed out. That program passed the Senate on the basis of a tie-breaking vote by the Vice President presiding in the chair. In other words, you had a 50-50 vote in the Senate, and the Vice President cast the tie-breaking vote. It would not have happened with a 60-vote requirement. Clearly, as many have pointed out in commenting about your amendment, in effect puts the power of decision in the hands of a minority, because it in effect says that 40% plus one in either house can block action. And as to monetizing the debt, we had a larger debt-to-income ratio by far at the end of World War II than we have today. 133%, and today it's at about 60% and on the decline. We never monetized that debt. I mean, it's a nice scare tactic in order to traumatize people, but it has not happened in our history at levels far higher than the levels that exist today. And today we're on a discipline to bring this deficit under control. We ought to stay the course and not sully the Constitution by seeking to amend it here tonight.
Madam President.
The senator from West Virginia.
Madam President, I thank my friend from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes. I also congratulate my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, the sponsors and co-sponsors of the amendment, and in particular, I compliment Mr. Simon. Madam President, William Gladstone is credited with calling the Constitution the most wonderful work ever struck off at a given time by the brain and purpose of man. The framers were familiar with Plato and Aristotle, Cicero and Plutarch and Polybius and Tacitus, Suetonius and Livius and Cato and others. The framers were steeped in the classical traditions of Rome. They were well acquainted with the colonial experience and with the English struggle and with Montesquieu and his political system of separation of powers. They were learned and sagacious men, practical men, men of common sense and understanding, men who possessed great wisdom and integrity. Almost every member of the Constitutional Convention had served in a colonial or state legislature, in the Albany Congress, in the First or Second Continental Congress, or the Congress of the Confederation. Franklin had helped to write the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation. They were men of wisdom and experience in government. Like the Magna Carta, the Constitution did not deal with abstract principles. In the words of John Marshall, the Constitution was intended to endure for ages to come. And in the words of James Madison, it proposed a constitutional system which should best secure the permanent liberty and happiness of our country and our people. It is this product of political genius and experience, this Constitution, which is the oldest and most successful written Constitution in history, that some in this great chamber are proposing to amend today. They seem to have given little thought and less examination to the consequences of this ill-conceived idea. I view the amendment as being pockmarked with flaws. To adopt it would be a colossal blunder. Heretofore, I have stated many objections. As the debate draws inexorably toward the end, and in view of the limited time remaining, I shall revisit but a few of the objections which are, in my judgment, fatal to the amendment's adoption. First, it is confusingly and hopelessly contradictive within itself. in that it unequivocally mandates in Section 1 a balanced budget annually, while simultaneously in Section 6 it proposes to violate that Section 1 mandate. In other words, it says on the one hand that the budget shall be balanced, and on the other hand that the budget does not have to be balanced. The chief proponent of the amendment, Mr. Simon, is fond of saying that the reason there were so many heroes at the Alamo was because there was no back door. Well, Section 6 is the back door to this Alamo amendment, through which all of us may escape without becoming heroes. Second, the Congress shall enforce the amendment in the year 2001, 7 years away. The fact is, Congress and the President can balance the budget without a constitutional amendment and are on the road toward doing so, having enacted a 5-year budget reduction package last year. Third, the amendment undermines a basic principle underlying our representative democracy, the principle of majority rule. For over 200 years, the body of the original Constitution has contained provisions for a supermajority vote in only 5 circumstances, and 3 of these have been seldom brought into play. In only 3 amendments to the Constitution, namely the 12th, the 14th, and the 25th, is there required a supermajority. Of these, the supermajority in the 12th Amendment has only to do with a quorum and has not been used in the election of a president by the House of Representatives since 1825, 169 years ago. The supermajority in the 14th Amendment has not been used in 96 years. The supermajority in the 25th Amendment has never been used. Now comes the Simon Amendment, which would add 2 more supermajorities. The Simon Amendment is a prescription for a minority rule. For the first time, fiscal and budgetary policy would be written into this Constitution, and the new supermajority vote requirements would likely be triggered annually. Thus, a minority in either body could extract from the majority concessions in exchange for their votes to waive Section 1, requiring a balanced budget annually. The 3/5 majority in this amendment thus being a sure prescription for gridlock. Section 2, with regard to raising the debt limit, would present similar prospects for gridlock and blackmail. Senator Simon has called this section the enforcer in his amendment. Mr. President, Section 2 is much more than an enforcer. Section 2 is the terminator. The terminator. If we cannot obtain the supermajorities required, we terminate the entire federal government. Just close down. Go home. This is brinkmanship at its most irresponsible. The wisdom of the framers in their sparing use of supermajority requirements was explained in the Federalist number 58 by James Madison. And I quote Madison, "It has been said that more than a majority ought to have been required for a quorum, and in particular cases, if not all, more than a majority of a quorum for a decision. In all cases where justice or the general good might require new laws to be passed, or active measures to be pursued, the fundamental principle of free government would be reversed. It would be no longer the majority that would rule. The power would be transferred to the minority, where the defensive privilege limited to particular cases, an interested minority might take advantage of it to screen themselves from equitable sacrifices to the general weal, or in particular emergencies to extort unreasonable indulgences. And that was Madison speaking. Madison was clearly against requiring more than a majority of a quorum for a decision. Fourth, the Danforth Amendment, while seeking to preclude the judiciary from inheriting powers of taxation under the Salmon Amendment, only raises new concerns. The Danforth Amendment would conflict with the due process clauses in the 5th and 14th Amendments. Serious implications arise from the Danforth Amendment. What are they? Number one, a court could decide not to hear a case brought under the Balanced Budget Amendment because it could say that the language of the Danforth Amendment, authorizing only a declaratory judgment, is to be construed as allowing only advisory opinions. Such opinions are not authorized for the federal judiciary under Article 3 of the Constitution. However, many state courts are authorized by their state constitutions to issue advisory opinions. Therefore, one could end up with a situation whereby the various state courts were issuing conflicting advisory opinions while the federal courts remained silent. Number two, normally a declaratory judgment can be used in subsequent cases as a statement of rights. But because the Danforth Amendment prohibits remedies and allows nothing other than a declaratory judgment, a judgment that stands alone and thus has no effect. Again, a declaratory judgment would therefore be seen as a mere advisory opinion. Number three, the terminology in the Danforth Amendment pertaining to cases arising under this article, quote, arising under this article, close quote, would not preclude cases arising under normal statutes. For example, if the President unilaterally decided to cut Social Security benefits in order to keep the budget in balance, a case could be brought under cover of the Social Security Act of 1935, the legislation that established the entitlement, and not under the Balanced Budget Amendment. What would the courts then do? First, they could agree to hear the case, arguing that the case was not brought under the Balanced Budget Amendment. Should that happen, then we're right back where we started, with the courts involved in issues that, as Assistant Attorney General Walter Dellinger stated, and I quote, they clearly lack the institutional capacity to resolve in any remotely satisfactory manner. On the other hand, Mr. President, if the courts decided not to hear the case, arguing that the case had indeed been brought under the Balanced Budget Amendment, then there would be no way to check the President's impoundment authority, the 1974 Budget Act notwithstanding. At that point, we might as well just close this body down. Members don't need to come back because the President will then have the total power over the purse. Obviously, the President will claim that any case brought against his impoundments was brought under the Balanced Budget Amendment. Number four, should the Congress, as part of its implementing legislation, attempt to restrict presidential impoundments under the balanced budget mandate, the President could simply veto that implementing legislation. Thus, it could end up that the Congress is unable to pass the necessary legislation that would implement the amendment. Now, Mr. President, this is the first time in our history that we will have constitutionally attempted to deny due process to the citizens of this country. Due process, with its roots running all the way back to the Magna Carta in 1215. The Danforth Amendment can, therefore, best be described as anti-constitutional and in direct opposition to the Fifth Amendment's Due Process Clause. Should the Congress fail to pass the implementing legislation, then the Danforth Amendment takes away the fundamental right of all citizens, of access to the courts as a means of redressing grievances. Takes away the fundamental rights of all citizens to have access to the courts as a means of redressing grievances. Moreover, the Danforth Amendment could deny Congress due process rights in any suit brought against the President as a consequence of his impounding of funds. I get that. The Danforth Amendment could deny Congress due process rights in any suit brought against the President as a consequence of his impoundment of funds. The President could impound at will, and there could be no check on the exercise of that power. None. The Danforth Amendment would eliminate existing judicial protection of Congress's historic powers of the purse. It would constitutionalize, not just legislate, constitutionalize line-item veto and impoundment and rescissions powers. This is a Congress stripping as well as a court stripping amendment. It brings us back to the balanced budget amendment's fundamental flaw. It sets up a seemingly simple, straightforward constitutional standard and then provides for its violation. And this conflict would be highlighted by the Danforth Amendment. It would authorize the courts to declare a governmental act to be in violation of the balanced budget amendment while forbidding the courts to enjoin that very unconstitutional act and denying to any citizen, north, west, south, and east, who is aggrieved by that unconstitutional act, the right to sue for damages. For example, while the amendment clearly bars plaintiffs' access to the courts to claim a violation of the amendment, it is not clear whether the proposed language also would bar governmental actors from raising the balanced budget amendment as a defense. Let us say that the President cuts Social Security. A plaintiff sues not under the balanced budget amendment, but under the statute. The President raises the defense that the balanced budget amendment justifies the action. How would a court rule? That the case should be dismissed because of the balanced budget amendment? But then all the President has to do to escape scrutiny is to invoke the amendment. Or would the court rule that the plaintiff wins because the court has no power to review the defense. If so, then other plaintiffs would bring similar actions and the budget would be unbalanced. If the amendment does succeed in stripping jurisdiction from the courts, this could result in a shift to the president of unreviewable power to impound or to rescind funds. This despite the framers' view that the power of the purse should be left in the hands of the legislative branch, the closest branch to the people and the closest representatives to the people. If Congress responds to presidential impoundment by granting the courts the power to review such actions, then the courts would again be embroiled in the budget process. With the courts having no power to prevent the aggrandizement of power by the executive branch, the executive would become far and away the dominant power, the dominant branch of the government. Finally, the Simon Amendment would be destructive of the constitutional system of checks and balances and separation of powers. No longer would the people's branch, Congress, have control over the power of the purse. The governmental structure would be changed, and once the president ever acquires line and item veto power or rescissions power or impoundment power, any law passed by Congress to remove such powers would be vetoed by the president. Mr. President, Madison stated in Federalist Paper number 48 that the legislative department alone has access to the pockets of the people. Madison also said in Federalist Paper 58, the power over the purse may in fact be regarded as the most complete and effectual weapon with which any constitution can arm the immediate representatives of the people for obtaining a redress of every grievance and for carrying into effect every just and salutary measure. Would Madison vote for the Simon Amendment to the Constitution? To ask the question is to answer it. Mr. President, this proposed constitutional amendment would in effect perform a lobotomy on the Constitution. Madison wouldn't vote for it. Jefferson wouldn't vote for it. George Washington wouldn't vote for it. Hamilton wouldn't vote for it. Benjamin Franklin wouldn't vote for it. It must be rejected by the Senate. Madison instructed us in the Federalist number 63 that there are particular moments in public affairs when the people, stimulated by some irregular passion or misled by the artful misrepresentations of interested men, may call for measures which they themselves will afterward be the most ready to lament and condemn. In these critical moments, how salutary will be the interference of some temperate and respectable body of citizens in order to suspend the blow meditated by the people against themselves until reason, justice, and truth can regain their authority over the public mind. What bitter anguish would not the people of Athens have often escaped if their government had contained so provident a safeguard against the tyranny of their own passions. Popular liberty would then have escaped the indelible reproach of decreeing to the same citizens the hemlock on one day and statues on the next. Madison was referring to the Senate in Federalist number 63, and today it is the Senate upon which the fate of the Constitution, as we have known it for 200 years, depends. Our forefathers had studied the causes of the Revolution too well not to know that one-man power would not be tolerated for a moment except by those who, to use the language of Thomas Jefferson, were born with saddles on their backs and bits in their mouths that tyrants may ride and spur them. The men of our early days had a perfect horror against conferring arbitrary power upon a single individual. For them, arbitrary power, whether hiding under the veil of legitimacy, skulking in the disguise of necessity, or wearing the shameless front of usurpation, was the sure object of their detestation and hostility. Mr. President, oh, that my tongue were in the thunder's mouth. Then with a passion would I shake the world. The gathered wisdom of 1,000 years cries out against this amendment. The history of England for centuries is against this amendment. The declarations of the men who framed the Constitution stand in this amendment's way. Let us resolve that our children will have cause to bless the memory of their fathers as we have cause to bless the memory of ours. Let us not have the arrogance to throw away centuries of English history and 200 years of the American experience for political expediency. This is not just a quick fix, throwaway piece of legislation crafted to take us off the hook. This is an amendment to the Constitution. The Constitution. An amendment to the Constitution of the United States of America, a sacred document, and changes to this Constitution must not be considered if they threaten a delicate balance, a balance based on thousands of years of experience, human experience. Amending the Constitution must never, never, never become a political solution for someone's re-election difficulties. We should be willing to pay the price, if necessary, of re-election. If that's what it costs, if it's what it costs me, then let it be the price. This senator has been around here quite a long time, and he has seen many senators come and go. He has seen venerable senators pass on to their reward. And they weren't remembered very long. Not very long. But if we emasculate this Constitution, then that wrong will be visited upon our children and our children's children. Let us step back from the unwise course here. And now, we have all of the tools that we now need with which to pursue the work of reducing the debt. We must not feed the nation this poison pill in the hopes that it will somehow force us to screw up our courage to act. Men and women have suffered and died for our freedoms. freedoms won with the blood of our forefathers. Let us not be so callous as to rob generations to come of the basic liberties that are their birthright, because some in this chamber have collectively thrown their hands in the air over the difficulty of reducing the debt. To do so would desecrate the memory of all those who have labored for liberty, fought and died for freedom, and dedicated their lives to passing on the legacy of a Constitution that is a sword against tyrants. Let us not crucify this Constitution on a cross of political expediency. Lord Nelson's last words when dying were, "Thank God, I have done my duty." I say, Senators, may God Almighty give us the courage to do our duty this day.
Chair would note that the time of the senator from West Virginia has expired. Under the previous order, the next 20 minutes are allocated to the Republican leader.
Mr. President, I suggest the absence of quorum.
Without it, Republican leader.
I yield 4 minutes, Senator from Arizona.
Senator from Arizona recognized.
President, I, too, am a student of history, and I, too, have studied this amendment and its various times that it's been before this body. And on August 19th, 1992, on 4 August 1992, I happened to come across the most impressive words that have been uttered on this subject that I know of. And those are the words of the distinguished chairman of the Appropriations Committee, and those words were so impressive that they bear repeating before this body today. And I won't say them in whole, but at least in part, the most impressive and compelling parts. Quote, "Nonetheless, I have decided to cast my vote in favor of the amendment. There are two main reasons for my decisions. First, we must all agree that excessive federal deficits are a matter of genuine concern. Somehow we must break our old habits and move back toward more prudent, more responsible fiscal policy. This amendment, even if imperfect, can be an instrument to help us in that difficult task." Quote, the distinguished then minority leader went on to say, "We have never had deficits in this country like we have today. We face an extraordinary situation, and perhaps the extraordinary step of a constitutional amendment is what we need to start on the road back to economic responsibility." Second, Mr. President, we must recall that the vote today is not the end of the process, but only the beginning. If the Senate approves this amendment, and if the House of Representatives approves a similar measure, in all likelihood, a conference will be necessary to develop a new version to be considered by both houses. It is my hope that many of my concerns and those of my colleagues will be alleviated by the work of that conference. If a conference version is approved by both houses, 3/4 of the state legislature must then ratify it in order for it to become law. A great national debate will take place. I believe that debate will be healthy. I believe it will force the citizens and elected officials to focus on the urgent questions of public spending and national priorities. Under our democratic system, to put a question of this magnitude directly to the people is a wise and proper action. Therefore, I will vote for the amendment and thus vote to put this question directly to the American people. I cannot doubt that their ultimate decision will be the right one. Mr. President, I would congratulate the distinguished chairman of the Appropriations Committee on those words. And Mr. President, I don't believe the history of Greece has changed. I don't believe the history of Rome has changed. I don't believe that the history of England has changed, and I don't believe the history of the United States has changed. I'll tell you what has changed since 1982, and that is Ronald Reagan's not President of the United States, and the distinguished senator from West Virginia is not the chairman of the Appropriations Committee. The fact is, Mr. President, the American people demand it, they deserve it, and they'll get it. Sooner or later, there will be a balanced budget amendment because 4-to-1 margin, the American people support and want this amendment, and they will get it because of the will of the people. will be done. I yield the balance of my time back to the distinguished Republican leader.
The leader, yield me 1 minute. The distinguished senator from Arizona mentioned my name, and he made reference to my vote in 1982, and he's perfectly right. He did not, however, point out that I had changed my mind by 1986 and voted against the constitutional amendment. James Russell Lowell said that only the foolish and the dead will never change their opinion. Well, I wasn't foolish, and I'm not yet dead, thank the Lord, and I changed my mind. I changed my mind in 1986. I made the right decision then, and I stand by that decision today, and that's the position I'm taking in this instance. I thank the distinguished Republican leader for his courtesy.
Mr. President.
The Republican leader.
How much time remaining?
The Republican leader has 15 minutes and 47 seconds remaining.
I don't believe I'll use all that time, but I would like to ask consent that my entire statement be made part of the record. Mr. President, there's been a great deal of debate on this amendment, and I want to congratulate parties on both sides for the debate. I know they're committed. But I really believe, as Senator from Arizona just pointed out, the American people aren't going to let us off the hook so easily. I assume we don't have the votes, the 67 votes needed, and I'm not certain we'll be able to, what will happen in the House, but if the House should pass the amendment, I'd hope that we'd have a chance to maybe revisit it this year in the United States Senate. And I think we could say we've tried a lot of bipartisan, partisan, nonpartisan, whatever ways to deal with the deficit. My colleague, Senator Kastelbaum, had a good piece today in the Washington Post, said we shouldn't amend the Constitution, we ought to amend our ways. And we ought to make the tough choices, and we ought to make the tough votes. And if everybody believed that as strongly as my colleague, I'd say that's what we ought to do. And it seems to me that if other people don't balance their budget, they're out of business, or they're in bankruptcy, or they're in deep trouble, or they're running to the bank. And that's not the case when we don't balance the budget. When the budget was released earlier this year, President Clinton all but declared victory against federal deficit. But anyone who took a careful look at the numbers quickly realized that any improvements in the deficit picture are temporary at best. The Congressional Budget Office forecasts the deficit will soar to $365 billion by the year 2004. Net interest payments, that's right, just interest payments on government debt will be $334 billion per year. That is more than this country will spend on all domestic discretionary programs in 1994, including programs for education, childhood immunization, and AIDS research, just to name a few. By the year 2004, the debt held by the public will be $6 trillion. That's $6 trillion with a T. And for that much money, we could buy any in-ground concrete swimming pool for every homeowner in the country, pay a 40-hour-a-week minimum wage paycheck for every person in the world, pay a year's tuition to Harvard University for every person under 18 in the United States, and send every person over the age of 18 in the United States on a 2-week Club Med vacation. We could do all those things and still have $5 trillion left. Now, the consequences of deficit spending, I think everybody agrees, a drag on our economy. Former Senator Paul Tsongas explained at last week's hearings, and I quote, "A nation spending $212 billion this year on interest on the debt will be less competitive than if it had invested the same $212 billion in our industrial base." Translated, this means that all across America, jobs that could have been or not, and as a direct real-life consequence, thousands of American families woke up this morning pained by a joblessness that was caused not by their own attitude, but by the fiscal irresponsibility of their leaders. This is a statement made by Senator Tsongas, former Senator Tsongas. The penalty for future generations is even higher. According to the President's own fiscal 1995 budget report, average net taxes for future generations will be a walloping 82% of their income, an 82% average tax rate. That compares to a net tax rate of just 23% for people born in 1900. And no doubt about it, simple fairness to future generations is the most compelling reason to support a balanced budget amendment. And we've made statements on the floor, you can bill me later, when's the credit card come due, all these things, somebody's going to have to pay. Sooner or later, we're not going to be able to put it off, and somebody's going to call in the credit card, and we're going to be out of luck. Now, you know, I think there's some who would say, well, to support this balanced budget amendment, then you go ahead and vote like you always did. In fact, I got a little shaken up when we had the vote on the earthquake. I'm trying to pay for it. Only got 43 votes. We weren't trying to withhold aid, but we're trying to pay for it, pay as you go, and we couldn't get 51 votes. So it did sort of shake me up on a balanced budget amendment, because I don't know that we can make the tough votes. We don't like to pay for things. We say it's an emergency. It is an emergency, but somebody has to pay for it. So that billions and billions of dollars was charged up to the future generation. And I want to say, first, I want to commend, as I did, the Senator from Illinois, Senator Simon, Senator from Utah, Senator Hatch, Senator from Idaho, Senator Craig, and Senator from South Carolina, and others who've taken the lead. This is not an easy thing to do. I also want to remind my colleagues who may have been here in 1985, when we pushed through a budget by a vote of 50 to 49 at 2 o'clock in the morning, 50 to 49, we had to bring Governor Wilson, then Senator Wilson in from the hospital, Vice President Bush had fly in from Arizona to break the tie. One Democrat voted with us, and it was a tough vote. We froze COLAs, we made all these tough choices, we made the tough votes. So I know how tough it is to make tough votes. Maybe we could, if we had a balanced budget amendment, maybe we'd have the discipline to do it. We've also supported a cap on entitlement spending and fought to pay for emergency spending with cuts in other spending programs. So I just want to make the point. Oh, there may be a few who just say, well, this is an easy way out. I can vote for this and then vote for everything else, and I can always talk about my vote on the balanced budget amendment. But that's going to be the exception. Balancing the budget will not be easy. But, you know, we weren't elected to make tough. We were elected to make tough calls and not to make who can make the biggest excuse. So I would say for my colleagues on this side of the aisle, and I think we're going to have nearly every one of our colleagues support this effort, and I commend them for that, I think all but two. We've supported measures in the past, and we'll support them again when the balanced budget amendment forces Congress and the President to face the music and to make tough choices. 2 weeks ago, all of our offices received copies of the administration's nightmare scenarios of what would happen if the balanced budget amendment passed. The New Republic wrote that the Treasury's examples are, quote, are not an argument against a balanced budget amendment. They're an argument against a balanced budget itself, end of quote. If that's what we want to do, that's what we can do. The bottom line is this administration looking for every excuse in the book to spend more money than Americans are willing to pay for in tax dollars. In reality, the burden of balancing the budget will be difficult, but not as difficult as the administration would like us to believe, and I'm certain it may have been true in other administrations, I don't know. But we came very close before. It's going to happen, as Senator from Arizona said, and I'm certain other senators said, it's going to happen, if not this year, next year, or the next year. And what we would do, we're not going to mechanically cut spending across the board. Congress and the President will, as they have in the past, set priorities and reduce spending in marginal programs. And secondly, the Treasury study exaggerates the depth of cuts by assuming no action is taken until 1997. The cuts are much more likely to be stretched out over 6 to 7 years, resulting in a reasonable glide path to a zero deficit. Another red herring being promoted by opponents is the Social Security issue. The biggest threat to Social Security is not the balanced budget, but the federal government's fiscal irresponsibility. As our interest payments mount, Congress will be increasingly tempted to raid the trust funds to make our balance sheets look better. And putting our house in order now will ensure Social Security remains sound for this and future generations. And many of us here in 1983, and we're very proud of the role we played in putting Social Security back together again. It was in deep, deep difficulty, and a bipartisan agreement. It passed the Senate by an overwhelming vote, passed the House by an overwhelming vote, and signed by President Reagan. And the Social Security system is sound. The argument that a balanced budget amendment will force us to balance the budget in periods of recession also holds no water. because you can waive that requirement if necessary by a 3/5 vote in each House, and I'm certain if it were necessary, the 3/5 vote would be there. And this is a necessary safeguard for any administration that might like to bypass spending ceilings by calling for 4-year-old highway repair, by calling them emergencies. That's the one we raised in the earlier debate where you had something that happened 4 years ago, 1989, suddenly called an emergency in 1994. And I would conclude by saying this amendment isn't perfect. If I could do one thing to improve this constitutional amendment, it would be to add a tax limitation provision. And this protection would require a 3/5 vote for tax increases above the rate of economic growth. And I've been a co-sponsor of this provision in the past and would support it again if it had been offered during this debate. The consensus among the supporters was that H.J. Res. 41 would have the best chance of passing if no additional changes were made, and certainly I yield to the wisdom of those who worked on this day and night in the past several years. So we agreed not to offer a tax limitation provision. Another concern put forward most notably by Judge Bork is that Congress may be tempted to balance the budget by mandating increases in state and local spending or by regulating private industry into doing what the federal government cannot. For example, requiring business to pick up the tab for health care spending may not cost the federal government a dime, but it will bankrupt companies around the country and cost many Americans their jobs. This is a real danger and one that Congress must guard against, but in my view, the dangers of an unbalanced budget greatly outweigh the risk of Congress passing a buck to local governments. I don't think we could get away with that very long. So I would say again, I want to express my appreciation to Senators Simon and Craig and Hatch and Thurman and many others who have done everything possible to keep a constitutional amendment to balance the budget on the front burner in spite of fierce opposition. Opposition from my friends, the Democratic leadership, and President Clinton. But, you know, two years ago, the amendment was defeated by 9 votes in the House. But I say again, if we could pass this amendment, if people really take a look at it, there's still a few minutes here, then I think we could vote for the 28th Amendment to the Constitution. So, Mr. President, I think this is a very, this vote's going to separate a lot of people. The American people understand this vote. Maybe there's some way you can explain it away. Maybe if you live in a safe enough state where you 3-to-1 registration, it doesn't make any difference. But if you really are as concerned as the American people are concerned about the future, we can talk about the fourth quarter of last year, all these things that are temporary. We're looking the next 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years under Democrat, Republican administrations, Democrat, Republican Senates, House, whatever. And if we don't want to make that choice, then I'm certain the American people will take notes. And I'm not suggesting that it's a perfect amendment, as I said. I know there are things that others would like to have done. And I could tell from the vote earlier today, when you put up a fig leaf, the American people aren't going to buy a fig leaf. The United States Senate didn't buy a fig leaf. The fig leaf was defeated by a vote of 78 to 22. 78 to 22. Which means this amendment ought to pass by a vote of 78 to 22, unless I've missed something. So this is the amendment, in my view, that deserves support of our colleagues across the aisle, both sides, nonpartisan, bipartisan, call it what you will. If you vote yes, you'll be casting your vote for the next generation of Americans, and someday they'll appreciate it. Mr. President, I have how much time remaining?
3 minutes remaining.
Then I have leader's time.
That is correct.
I would like to yield 5 minutes to Senator Hatch and 5 minutes to Senator Simon.
Is there? The senator has that right.
And then I yield back the balance of my time.
Senator.
Well, I thank the minority leader, and I thank him for his remarkable statement here this evening. This is a very, very important vote. Right now, it does look as though we're not going to make it, unless some people who really understand how important this vote is change their minds. Mr. President, this battle has to be waged, and it will be waged year after year after year until we finally pass this balanced budget amendment. For almost 60 years, we have spent this country right into bankruptcy. I've talked in terms of how the increases in national debt have increased our annual interest payment that we're just throwing down the drain. That payment is now involving $18,000 in national debt per individual and almost $3,000 in interest payments every year per individual man, woman, and child in this country. And yet we have people on this floor saying, look, we got to have the backbone and we've got to stand up and we have the guts and the right to do this ourselves, but for 60 years we haven't done it. Mr. President, we can go on and on doing what we're doing with no real fiscal discipline because there's no real obligation to do it, just funding everything as though the monies are there, and gradually reach a point where we have to monetize the debt and our dollars are not worth very much. If we keep doing that, we will truly abdicate our responsibilities and we will send this country right down the drain. And what really bothers me is not so much that we're making these mistakes that might hurt us in this day and age, we're making them for generations to come, for our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. And ultimately, if we keep going this way, there won't be any real defense funds of any value in this country. There aren't going to be the solid, valuable Social Security payments that will be made. They'll be the first people to get hurt. And if we continue on the way we're going, we're going to have a devaluation of the dollar, we're going to have more inflation, we're going to have more difficulties along those lines, and in the end, what's going to happen is we're going to have everybody hurt who is on fixed income, who have nowhere to look but to the government, and the government won't be there like it should be because we've run it into bankruptcy. And Mr. President, this amendment just does some very simple things. It says that if you want to spend, you can, but you have to have a 3/5 vote to do it if you want to go beyond a balanced budget. If you want to increase taxes to help with balanced budget or otherwise, you can, but you have to have a constitutional majority of at least 51 senators in the Senate vote for it. It provides in Article 6 that Congress can set up a system of reaching that balanced budget on that glide path to 2001. If we do these type of things, we will then set in place a fiscal discipline where members of Congress will have to make priority choices among competing programs, and that would be very beneficial to the country. Now, I despair for my grandchildren. Elaine and I have 14 grandchildren, and I don't see a great future for them if we don't start doing what's right in the Congress. And just saying we're going to do it doesn't cut the mustard. There are too many conflicts. And as much as people decry Graham-Rudman-Hollings, it did work to a degree and did have that path going downward, but we couldn't live up to it because it was a mere statute. It wasn't in the basic document. It wasn't imposed by an oath of office upon all of us as in the sense of a constitutional amendment. And certainly we should have taken it seriously. But it didn't work. I remember back in 1979 when Harry Byrd came on the floor and he passed an amendment that required us to balance the budget by a certain few years hence. It required us an overwhelming vote, and it was ignored the day afterwards by any subsequent spending proposal that passed by a majority vote. Now that's what's been going on for 60 years. That's certainly been going on for 33 of the last 34 years, during which time we've never balanced the budget, and we are incurring more and more increasing deficits. True for a little dip because of the tax program of the president this last year. We will have the budget go down just a little bit up through 96, and then all of a sudden it shoots straight up in the air again. What are we going to do? Tax the American people even more? Spend even more? Nobody seems to want to do what it takes to really get this economy under control. Well, Mr. President, we could do something about it here this evening. We could vote for this balanced budget amendment, take 67 votes on the floor this evening. If we vote for it, we'll be on our way to fiscal sanity. We'll be on our way to solving these problems. Or we can ignore it, and we can continue just the way we are, with the promises that we're going to get our things under control here because we should have the fiscal discipline to do it. I thank the chair.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Illinois.
First, I want to thank Senator Dole for yielding the time. We heard my friend Senator Robert Byrd say that we're injecting fiscal policy into the Constitution. Fiscal policy is in the Constitution a great many times already. We are adding a protection, and that's what the Constitution is. It is a protection for the people against governmental abuse. And anyone who's looked at the last 25 years who doesn't believe there's governmental abuse, you're living in a dream world. Listen to Professor Larry Tribe, and he is opposed to the amendment. I don't want to mislead anyone. He was a lead witness against the balanced budget amendment 2 years ago. Listen to what he said in his testimony before the Senate committee. Despite the misgivings I expressed on this score a decade ago, I no longer think that a balanced budget amendment is, at a conceptual level, an ill-suited kind of provision to include in the Constitution. The Jeffersonian notion that today's populace should not be able, by profligate borrowing, to burden future generations with excessive debt does seem to be the kind of fundamental value that is worthy of enshrinement in the Constitution. In a sense, it represents a structural protection for the rights of our children and our grandchildren. Second, the senator from Maryland said, we really don't have that much debt. There is no problem on monetizing the debt. The reality is, when he quotes the statistics, he ignores something very fundamental. The gross debt in 1945 was about 130% relative to GDP. But there was virtually no corporate and consumer debt. When you add consumer debt and corporate debt to government debt today, we have roughly 200%. And you just take the OMB figures. We're headed toward a policy and a situation where every other nation in history has monetized the debt. We heard a great deal of history from our colleague, Senator Byrd. We did not hear one bit of history, and that is that every other nation that has gone down this road has started printing money, has had hyperinflation, has monetized the debt. And then finally, Senator Byrd indicated that Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and James Madison would be voting against this amendment. I can't speak for them real candidly, but when I read what Thomas Jefferson has to say about debt, I have a pretty clear idea. When I look at Washington's farewell address, he spends a good portion of his farewell address telling the nation to avoid the accumulation of debt. I think it's very clear what our founding fathers wanted. Again, every generation of Americans has taken care of themselves and invested in the future up until this generation. We're partially taking care of ourselves and borrowing from the future. That has to change, Mr. President, and we have the opportunity tonight to change it, and I hope we do the right thing for our country and for the future.
George, will you give me 30 seconds?
Yes, I'll yield to the senator.
Under the previous order, the next 20 minutes are allocated to the majority leader.
President, I yield 2 minutes to the senator from Maryland from my leader time.
Senator from Maryland.
Mr. President, I want to make 2 points. First, I want to underscore the fact, although the senator stated it at the outset, but he then quoted Larry Tribe. The fact is that in the course of that quote, Tribe was against the balanced budget amendment.
I said that.
All right. And secondly, with respect to Jefferson,